They say music has the power to soothe the savage beast, but in the untamed territories of the American West, sometimes it took more than a gentle tune to stay alive. Among the countless tales of gunslingers and outlaws that colored the frontiers, bloody history, perhaps none is more intriguing than the legend of Michael "Sweet Note" Sullivan, a man whose violin case carried more than just strings and bow. In the years following the Civil War, when the West was still wild and justice came, more often from the barrel of a gun than a courtroom, Sullivan's name was whispered in saloons from Texas to Montana. Some claimed he could play a melody so sweet it would bring tears to a killer's eyes, while others swore they'd seen him gun down 4 men in the time it took to play a single note. But like many legends of the frontier, the truth about Sweet Note Sullivan was far more complex than the tales told around campfires. Join me today as we uncover the remarkable story of the deadliest musician ever to ride the Western trails. And if you're enjoying this tale, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story about the Ghost Marshal of Yellow Rock will leave you speechless. Deadwood, Dakota Territory, summer of 1876. The town was experiencing a gold rush that brought both fortune seekers and fortune takers in equal measure. Among the latter were the notorious Carson brothers, 3 men whose capacity for violence was matched only by their contempt for anything resembling civilization. They'd been in town for 3 days, and already 2 men had died trying to stand up to them. It was on a sweltering afternoon in July when a stranger rode in, the kind of arrival that would later be recounted in a dozen different ways by those who witnessed it. He sat straight in his saddle, but not with the rigid posture of a gunfighter. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, a brown coat despite the heat, serviceable boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. Most notable was the violin case strapped carefully to his saddle, its leather worn smooth by years of travel. Sheriff Marcus Wade, watching from the shade of his office porch, would later write in his journal, "There's something about certain men that sets them apart. Not the obvious things like how they carry their guns or the way they dress, but something in their eyes. This musician had those eyes, the kind that have seen too much, but somehow haven't lost their ability to see beauty in the world." The stranger tied his horse outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, carefully removed his violin case, and stepped through the batwing doors. Inside, the usual afternoon crowd had gathered to escape the heat, including all 3 Carson brothers. Jesse Carson, the youngest, was already drunk and looking for entertainment. The stranger made his way to the bar, setting his violin case down with the gentle care of someone handling something precious. "Water, if you please," he said softly. To the bartender, his voice carrying a slight Irish lilt that would later become part of his legend. "Hey, music man," Jesse Carson's voice cut through the saloon's ambient noise. "Why don't you pull out that fiddle and give us a tune? Been a while since we had any real entertainment in this hole." The stranger seemed to consider this for a moment, taking a slow sip of his water. "Not today, friend. The strings need time to settle after a long ride. Heat's not good for them." Something in his polite refusal seemed to anger Jesse Carson. Like many bullies, he took courtesy for weakness. "Wasn't really asking, friend." The way he said the last word made it sound like a curse. The saloon grew quiet, the kind of silence that falls when everyone knows trouble is brewing. The stranger turned slowly, and those close enough noticed something odd. Despite the threat in Carson's voice, the musician's eyes showed no fear. If anything, there was a hint of weary resignation in them, as if he'd played out this scene too many times before. "The violin stays in its case," he said quietly, "but I'd be happy to buy you a drink instead." Frank Carson, the eldest of the brothers, stood up from his poker game. "You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work in Deadwood. When a Carson makes a request, wise men treat it like a command." The stranger's hand remained resting lightly on his violin case. And if I'm not a wise man? It was such a simple question, asked so mildly that it took the Carsons a moment to recognize it for what it was, a challenge. By then, though none of them knew it yet, their fates were already sealed. The deadly ballet was about to begin, and Sweet Note Sullivan was about to add another verse to his legend. The silence in the $silver saloon grew heavier, like the air before a storm. Luke Carson, the middle brother, had already shifted his position, moving away from the bar with the casual grace of a mountain lion preparing to pounce. Few people in Deadwood had noticed before, but Luke was always the tactical one, the planner who made their violence seem almost choreographed. "Maybe," Frank Carson said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake about to strike, "you'd like to reconsider your position on playing for us. Hate to see such a fine instrument get damaged." His hand rested casually on his gun belt, fingers drumming against the worn leather. The stranger's eyes tracked every movement, though he appeared relaxed, almost disinterested. Sarah Mackenzie, the saloon's owner, watched from behind the bar, with growing concern. In her 15 years running establishments in frontier towns, she'd developed an instinct for violence. Something about this scene felt different from the usual drunk cowboy posturing. "You know what I find interesting?" the musician said softly, his Irish lilt making the words sound almost musical. "How men like you always travel in packs. Like wolves, you'd say, except wolves have honor." He lifted his water glass, took another, slow sip. "But more like coyotes, I'm thinking, only brave when the odds are in your favor." Jesse Carson's face flushed red with rage and whiskey. His hand dropped to his gun, but Frank held up a staying hand. The eldest Carson had survived this long by knowing when something felt wrong, and every instinct was screaming at him now. "You've got a mighty loose tongue for a fiddler," Frank said carefully. "Man could get killed talking like that in Deadwood." The stranger smiled, but it never reached his eyes. Those eyes, several witnesses would later swear, had taken on a different quality, like winter ice over deep water. "True enough. But tell me, Mr. Carson, have you heard any music coming from this case since I walked in?" The question seemed to hang in the air, and understanding dawned slowly on Frank Carson's face. His hand moved with snake-like speed toward his gun, but he never cleared leather. The stranger's movement was like lightning, his coat sweeping back to reveal a Remington 1875 that seemed to materialize in his hand. "Too slow, Mr. Carson," the stranger said softly. "About 3 beats too slow if we're keeping time." Sheriff Wade, hearing the commotion, appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene, the Carson brothers frozen in various stages of drawing their weapons, the stranger's Remington trained unwavering on Frank Carson's chest, the deathly silence of the crowd. "Everything all right in here?" Wade asked, though he already knew the answer. "Just having a discussion about music, Sheriff," the stranger replied, his gun never wavering. "These gentlemen were kind enough to request a performance, but I'm afraid my instrument isn't suited for their tastes." Understanding passed between the lawman and the stranger. Wade had worn a badge long enough to recognize what he was seeing, not just skill with a gun, but the kind of controlled violence that came from years of deadly experience. "Carson brothers," Wade said firmly, "I believe it's time you moved along. Your kind of entertainment isn't welcome here." For a moment it seemed like Frank Carson might risk it anyway, but survival instinct won out over pride. With a gesture to his brothers, he backed away from the bar. "This ain't finished," he growled. "No," the stranger agreed, finally lowering his Remington, "but the next verse will be played in a different key." As the Carsons slunk out of the saloon, Sarah Mackenzie approached the bar. "Your water's gone warm," she said, replacing his glass. "Mind telling us who you really are, mister?" The stranger considered Sarah Mackenzie's question while carefully returning his Remington to its holster. The movement was smooth, practiced, the kind of fluid grace that comes only from years of experience. Outside, the sound of the Carson brothers' horses faded into the dusty afternoon. "Name's Michael Sullivan," he said finally, his Irish lilt softening the words, "though some folks have taken to calling me other things." He placed his violin case on the bar with careful reverence, his fingers tracing the worn leather almost unconsciously. Sarah studied him with the shrewd eye of someone who'd spent years reading men's faces across a bar. "Sweet Note Sullivan," she said quietly. "Heard tell of you down Texas way. They say you played a concert in Austin one night, and by morning 3 of the state's most wanted men were found dead in their beds." A ripple went through the saloon. Even Sheriff Wade, still standing by the door, straightened slightly at the name. Sweet Note Sullivan's reputation had spread through the territories like wildfire over the past 2 years. A peculiar mix of beauty and violence, music and death. "Stories grow tall as corn in summer," Sullivan replied mildly, but didn't deny it. "Though I did play in Austin. Beautiful opera house they've built there. They also say," Wade added, moving to the bar, "that you used to ride with the Texas Rangers." "That true?" Sullivan's eyes took on that distant look that many veterans got when remembering the war. "Rode with them for a spell, yes. After the war, when the territory needed taming, found I had a talent for hunting men who needed hunting." He paused, taking another sip of water. "Found I had a talent for music, too. One brings beauty to the world, the other removes ugliness from it. A fair balance, I'd say." The saloon's piano player, an old man named Doc Wheeler, who'd played his way across every frontier town worth mentioning, spoke up from his corner. "What brings a man like you to Deadwood? Can't imagine it's our appreciation of fine music." Sullivan smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Heard talk of a man named Marcus Pike giving a concert up in Cheyenne next month. Thought I might head that way, maybe share a stage with him." The way he said it made it clear to everyone that sharing a stage wasn't his primary purpose. Sarah Mackenzie's face paled slightly. "Marcus Pike? The same Marcus Pike who led that gang that hit the orphanage in Laramie?" "The very same," Sullivan nodded. "Man's developed quite a taste for culture since then. Plays the violin himself now, I hear. Even funded the new concert hall in Cheyenne." His voice hardened slightly. "Amazing what blood money can buy." Sheriff Wade moved closer, lowering his voice. "Pike's got 20 men around him at all times. Mean ones? Word is he hired half the gunmen in Wyoming territory for protection." 21, Sullivan corrected quietly. "He hired Luke Carson last month, which explains why our friends were so interested in my violin case." He opened it slowly, revealing not just a beautifully maintained Stradivarius, but also a custom-modified Smith & Wesson Russian tucked into a hidden compartment. They weren't looking for a concert. They were sizing me up for their new employer. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows down Deadwood's main street. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the Black Hills, promising a storm. Inside the Silver Dollar, the gathered crowd watched Sullivan with a new understanding. They'd just witnessed the opening notes of what promised to be a deadly symphony. Word spread through Deadwood like wildfire, traveling from saloon to shop, from miners to merchants. Sweet Note Sullivan was in town. By sunset, the stories had already grown taller than the Black Hills themselves. Some claimed he'd killed all 3 Carson brothers in a gunfight that defied the laws of nature. Others swore he'd played a tune so haunting it had driven them from town. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between. At the Lucky Strike Hotel, the Carson brothers were holding council in their second-floor room. Luke Carson stood by the window, watching the street below, with the careful attention of a man who'd survived countless ambushes. Frank paced the worn floorboards, while Jesse nursed both his wounded pride and a bottle of whiskey. "Pike needs to know about this," Luke said finally, turning from the window. "Sullivan's no common bounty hunter. He's something else entirely." Frank stopped pacing. "You worked close with Pike. What's the real story there? Why's a man like that so worried about one violin player?" Luke's face darkened. 2 years ago, Pike's brother Thomas was found dead in his San Antonio mansion. Real mysterious-like. No marks on him, doors all locked from the inside. Only strange thing was the violin music folks heard coming from the house that night. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Week later, 3 more of Pike's men turned up the same way. Since then, he's been obsessed with finding the man they call Sweet Note. Back at the Silver Dollar, Sullivan sat at a corner table, his violin case resting beside him. Sarah Mackenzie had brought him a plate of stew, and Sheriff Wade had pulled up a chair, his badge catching the lamplight as evening settled in. "Pike's got his fingers in everything between here and Texas," Wade said quietly. "Mining claims, cattle operations, railroad contracts. Man's practically building an empire." Sullivan nodded, breaking off a piece of cornbread. "Built on blood and stolen dreams. That orphanage in Laramie was just the beginning. Every enterprise he touches turns deadly for anyone who stands in his way." Doc Wheeler had moved from his piano to join them, his ancient hands cradling a coffee cup. "Heard tell he's got a special fondness for burning out homesteaders who won't sell. Makes it look like Indian raids." "That he does," Sullivan agreed softly. "And pays well to keep lawmen looking the other way." His eyes met Wade's. "Present company accepted, I'm thinking." Wade's face hardened. "Lost my deputy last month investigating one of Pike's operations. Boy was barely 20, found him in a gulch, shot in the back." A commotion outside drew their attention. Horses were approaching, a lot of them. Sullivan's hand moved casually to his gun, but it was only a group of miners returning from their claims. Still, the tension in the saloon remained palpable. "Carson, your brothers won't let this go," Sarah said, joining their table. "Not with Pike's money behind them." "No," Sullivan agreed, "but they're not my concern. They're just coyotes yapping at the heels of a wolf. Pike's the real threat." He opened his violin case, and this time he removed the instrument itself. The Stradivarius gleamed in the lamplight, its surface reflecting decades of care and craftsmanship. "Sometimes," he said, testing the strings with practiced fingers, "the best way to flush out a wolf is to play a tune he can't resist dancing to." The first notes filled the saloon, a haunting Irish melody that seemed to carry all the sorrow and beauty of the frontier in its strains. The conversations died away as people turned to listen, many remembering softer times and distant homes. Outside, in the gathering darkness, Luke Carson watched from across the street as the music drifted through the saloon's windows. He'd seen enough death to recognize when it was approaching, and everything about Sweet Note Sullivan whispered of the grave. Turning his horse, he spurred it toward the telegraph office. Marcus Pike needed to know what kind of storm was heading his way. In Cheyenne's newly constructed Grand Opera House, Marcus Pike sat alone in his private box, running his fingers over the polished wood of his own violin. The telegram from Luke Carson lay open on the table beside him, its words burning in his mind like brands. "Sweet Note Sullivan in Deadwood, heading your way." Pike was not a man given to easy fear. He'd built his empire through a calculated mix of charm and brutality, always keeping his own hands clean while others did the bloody work. But Sullivan, that was different. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear the violin music that had played the night his brother died. Mr. Pike, his security chief, a former cavalry officer named Morrison, appeared in the doorway. "The men you requested from Denver have arrived." Pike nodded, carefully returning his violin to its velvet-lined case. "How many?" 15, all experienced. Added to what we already have, that puts us at nearly 40 guns. "Double the guards on every entrance," Pike ordered, standing to adjust his immaculate suit. "I want men watching the railroad station, the stage depot, every trail into town. Sullivan won't get within a mile of this place without us knowing." But even as he gave the orders, Pike knew better. Sweet Note Sullivan had a way of appearing like a ghost, leaving only death in his wake. The thought made him touch the derringer hidden in his vest pocket, a nervous habit he'd developed since San Antonio. Meanwhile, back in Deadwood, Sullivan had moved his few possessions to a room above the Silver Dollar. Sarah Mackenzie had insisted, saying she slept better, knowing he was close by. The Carson brothers still hadn't returned to town, but their absence felt more threatening than their presence. "I'd got word from my friend at the telegraph office," Sheriff Wade said, joining Sullivan for breakfast. "There's been a lot of traffic between here and Cheyenne. Pike's calling in every gunman he can find." Sullivan buttered a biscuit with methodical precision. "Good. Saves me the trouble of hunting them down one by one." "You're talking about taking on an army," Wade cautioned. "Even with your reputation—" "Reputation," Sullivan interrupted softly, "is just smoke and mirrors, Sheriff. Like any good performance, it's what the audience believes that matters." He took a bite of the biscuit, chewed thoughtfully. "But I'll tell you something about Marcus Pike that's not widely known. Man's got a weakness for music that borders. An obsession. Spends more on musicians than he does on gunmen." Doc Wheeler, setting up for the day at his piano, turned with interest. "That why you're really heading to Cheyenne? The concert?" "Pike's planning something big," Sullivan nodded, "gathering all the territory's most prominent citizens for a grand performance. Governors, judges, railroad men, anyone who's ever taken his money or looked the other way, all in one place, all there to watch him play his blood-bought violin." Sarah, who'd been listening from behind the bar, came closer. "Sounds like a trap to me." "Oh, it is," Sullivan agreed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But sometimes the best way to disarm a trap is to step right into it, especially when you're the one it's meant for." The morning sun streamed through the saloon's windows, catching the dust motes in its beams. Outside, Deadwood was coming to life, miners heading to their claims, merchants opening their shops. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, a sense that something momentous was building. Sullivan opened his violin case, but this time he reached for the hidden compartment, checking his guns with the same care he showed his instrument. "Music and death," he mused quietly. "They're not so different, really. Both require perfect timing, precision, and most importantly," he clicked the revolver's cylinder into place, "an appreciative audience." In Cheyenne, Marcus Pike was about to give him exactly that. The next few days in Deadwood took on a strange rhythm, like the calm before a storm. Sullivan spent his mornings practicing his violin, the haunting melodies drifting down Main Street. In the afternoons, he could be found at the shooting range, behind the livery stable, his accuracy with both revolvers drawing quiet crowds of onlookers. But it was his evenings that truly captured the town's imagination. Each night, he would perform at the Silver Dollar, his music transforming the rough saloon into something almost sacred. Even the hardest miners would fall silent, lost in memories of more civilized places. "Never seen anything like it," Doc Wheeler confided to Sheriff Wade as they watched Sullivan play. "Man handles that bow like he handles his gun, precise, controlled, but with something deadly underneath." Wade nodded, noting how Sullivan always positioned himself with a clear view of both the front door and the back entrance. "Been asking around about him. Stories go back years. Before the Rangers, he studied music in Boston, was headed for concert. Halls before the war changed everything. The war had changed many things, but for Sullivan, the real transformation came after. The death of his family at the hands of deserters turned bandits had turned a promising musician into something else entirely. He'd joined the Rangers seeking justice, but found instead a talent for dealing death that matched his gift for music. Meanwhile, the Carson brothers had made their way to Cheyenne, arriving at Pike's opera house, dust-covered and grim. Their report drove Pike into a calculated fury. "You're telling me," Pike said softly, his quiet tone more frightening than any shout, "that you not only failed to stop him, but you revealed our connection." He stood at his office window, watching workers hang posters for the upcoming concert. "He already knew," Luke Carson defended. "Known all along, I reckon. Man's been hunting you systematic-like, using that violin as cover to get close to your operations." Pike turned, his refined features marked by a cold intensity. "Then we'll have to change his tune." He walked to his desk, removing a stack of letters. "I want these delivered to every gunman between here and the Mississippi. $5,000 to any man who brings me Sullivan's head before the concert." Frank Carson shifted uncomfortably. "That kind of bounty's going to bring every killer in the territory." "Exactly," Pike smiled. "Let's see how our musical friend handles a different kind of audience." Back in Deadwood, Sullivan was teaching Sarah Mackenzie's young daughter Emma to play a simple melody on his violin. The girl's small hands struggled with the instrument, but her face shone with determination. "Music's a lot like life," Sullivan told her, adjusting her grip on the bow. "Find the right rhythm, maintain control, and even the most complex pieces become possible." Sarah watched from the bar, seeing a softer side to the deadly gunman. But the moment was interrupted by Deputy Wilson bursting through the doors. "Riders coming," he announced breathlessly. "Lots of them, and they don't look friendly." Sullivan carefully took his violin, returning it to its case. "How many?" "At least 15. Look like bounty hunters from their gear." The saloon quickly emptied as word spread. Sullivan remained calm, checking his guns with the same care he'd shown the violin moments before. "Miss Emma," he said softly, "why don't you and your mother head down to the cellar for a spell?" Sarah hesitated. "You can't face that many alone." "Not alone," Sheriff Wade said from the doorway, his rifle in hand. "Some music requires accompaniment." Sullivan's smile held no humor. "Pike's opening move," he said, positioning himself by the window, sending others to do his killing as usual. He checked the angle of the sun, calculating shadows and sightlines. "Let's show these bounty hunters why some songs are best left unsung." The thunder of approaching hooves grew louder as the first riders appeared at the end of the street. The deadly concert was about to begin. Deadwood's main street emptied, as if by magic, shopkeepers locking their doors and citizens scrambling for cover. The only sounds were the approaching hoofbeats and the creak of wagons being positioned as makeshift barricades. Sheriff Wade had positioned deputies at strategic points, but everyone knew the coming battle would center on the Silver Dollar Saloon. Sullivan stood just inside the batwing doors, as calm as if he were preparing for a concert. 15 riders, he said softly to Wade, "but watch the roof lines. Smart hunters always position shooters high." As if confirming his words, movement flickered across the roof of the assay office. Wade raised his rifle, but Sullivan's hand stayed. "Him." "Not yet. Let them set their stage. Every performance needs proper preparation." The bounty hunters spread out along the street, their leader, a scared-faced man in a black duster, reining up in the center. "Sweet Note Sullivan," he called out. 5,000 in gold for your head. Come out now. Might even let you try playing that fiddle one last time." Sullivan's response was unexpected. He opened his violin case, removed the instrument, and began to play. The music that drifted out onto the street was no gentle melody, but the fierce, driving rhythm of an Irish war song. The bounty hunters shifted uneasily in their saddles, thrown off by this strange response. "Man's lost his mind," one of them muttered, but their leader held up a staying hand, sensing a trap. He was right to be cautious. As Sullivan played, Wade noticed how the music covered other sounds. The soft scuff of deputies moving into position, the click of weapons being readied. The melody was creating a web of sound that masked their preparations. "Now," Sullivan said quietly, ending the song with a sharp note. The violence that followed was like a deadly symphony. Wade's first shot took the rooftop sniper before he could fire. Sullivan's Remington seemed to materialize in his hand as he stepped through the doors, each shot finding its mark with musical precision. 3 riders fell before the others could even draw their weapons. "Surround him!" the leader shouted. But his men were already in chaos. Sullivan moved like a dancer between their shots, every motion fluid and precise. 2 more bounty hunters fell to Wade's rifle, while Sullivan's revolvers spoke in rhythmic pairs. The leader, showing more courage than sense, spurred his horse directly at Sullivan. The musician gunman waited until the last moment before stepping. Aside, his gun barking once. The leader toppled from his saddle, dead before he hit the dirt. The remaining bounty hunters broke formation, trying to retreat under fire. Sullivan let them go, knowing that survivors would spread the word. Better to let Pike know exactly what he was facing. When the dust settled, 8 bodies lay in the street. The others had fled, leaving their dead behind. Not a single townsperson had been injured. "Like a damn magic show," Deputy Wilson breathed, emerging from his position. "Never seen anything like it." Sullivan was already checking his guns, reloading with practiced efficiency. "Not magic," he corrected. "Timing, music and gunfighting aren't so different. Both require you to know exactly when to strike and when to pause." Sarah Mackenzie emerged from the cellar with Emma, surveying the aftermath. "Will there be more?" "Yes," Sullivan said, his voice gentle despite the carnage around him. "Pike's testing my defenses, seeing how I handle different styles of opposition. This was just the opening movement." Wade helped his deputies begin clearing the street. "What's the next movement likely to be?" Sullivan returned his violin to its case, carefully wiping trail dust from its surface. "Pike's a student of strategy. He'll send professionals next, men like the Carson brothers, who know how to plan, how to coordinate." He looked toward the distant hills where the survivors had fled. This bunch was just percussion. Loud, but simple. The next movement will require more sophisticated instruments. As if in response to his words, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming to Deadwood, and not just the kind that brought rain. Marcus Pike stood in his private box at the Cheyenne Opera House, watching the surviving bounty hunters tell their tale. Their fear was evident even from this distance, not just of Sullivan's guns, but of the almost supernatural precision with which he'd orchestrated their defeat. 8 dead, Morrison reported, standing at Pike's shoulder. All of them experienced men. Witnesses say he moved like he was conducting an orchestra, every shot perfectly timed. Pike lifted his violin, running his fingers along its strings. "You know what fascinates me about music, Morrison? The mathematics of it. Every note, every pause, calculated to create a perfect whole." He played a short, sharp sequence. "Sullivan understands this. He's not just fighting, he's composing." The Carson brothers stood in the shadows of the box, Luke's tactical mind already working on the problem. "We need to change the tempo," he said. "Sullivan's used to controlling the rhythm of a fight. We need to force him to play at our speed." Pike lowered his violin, a cold smile touching his lips. "Go on." Those bounty hunters came at him straight on, like a marching band playing at full volume. "We need something more orchestrated." Luke stepped forward, spreading a map of Deadwood on the table. "I know that town, every alley, every rooftop. Give me 20 men, not gunslingers but soldiers, men who understand coordinated action." Brent Carson nodded, catching his brother's thinking. "Split them into smaller units, hit him from multiple directions, keep him off balance." "Better yet," Pike mused, "we make him come to us." He turned to Morrison. "That mining family outside. And town, the Hendersons. They've been refusing to sell their claim. How many children do they have?" 3, Morrison answered. "Youngest is just 6. "Perfect." Pike's refined features showed no emotion. Sullivan has a weakness for protecting innocents. Let's use that. Send word to our friends among the Sioux. Promise them the usual compensation for a raid, but this time..." He paused, playing another short sequence on his violin. "We'll compose the music ourselves." Back in Deadwood, Sullivan sat cleaning his guns, while Doc Wheeler played a soft melody on the saloon piano. The bodies of the bounty hunters had been buried, their horses sold to cover the undertaker's costs, but there was no celebration in the silver dollar. Everyone knew this was just the beginning. "Letter came for you," Sarah said, bringing him a sealed envelope. Ryder brought it from the Henderson place up by Copper Creek. Sullivan opened it carefully, his expression unchanging as he read, but those who knew him well noticed the subtle tension that crept into his shoulders. "Trouble?" Sheriff Wade asked. From his position by the window. "Pike's changing his tune," Sullivan replied softly. "Moving from percussion to strings." He handed the letter to Wade. "The Hendersons are reporting Indian signs around their property. Fresh tracks, broken branches, smoke signals in the hills." Wade's face darkened. "Sioux haven't raided this far south in months, not since Pike started paying them to hit specific targets." "Exactly." Sullivan stood, checking his ammunition with methodical care. "He's trying to draw me out. Knows I can't. Ignore a threat to innocent folk, especially children. It's a trap," Sarah said, worry clear in her voice. "Of course it is." Sullivan opened his violin case, but this time he removed something from a hidden compartment they hadn't seen before. A long-range Sharps rifle, broken down into components. But Pike forgets. Some instruments can play from a very long distance. Emma, watching from the stairs, spoke up suddenly. "Will you play us one more song before you go, Mr. Sullivan? For luck?" The gunman's face softened slightly. He took out his violin, positioning it with the same precision he showed. With his weapons, the melody that filled the saloon was an old Irish blessing, a prayer for protection in dark times. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and gunpowder. Pike's next movement was about to begin, but this time Sullivan wouldn't be the only one following a prepared score. Dawn broke over the black hills like a whispered note, pale light creeping across the rugged landscape. Sullivan had left Deadwood hours earlier, riding out under cover of darkness. The Sharps rifle was strapped alongside his violin case, both instruments of their own kind of justice. At the Henderson homestead, smoke rose from the chimney as the family began their day, unaware of the deadly composition being orchestrated around them. From his position on a ridge overlooking the property, Sullivan studied the terrain through his brass spyglass. "Tracks are wrong," he muttered to himself, noting the signs visible in the early light. "Sioux don't circle a target like this. They're trying too hard to look authentic." Sheriff Wade had insisted on coming along, positioning himself on a parallel ridge. They'd worked out a system of signals using reflected sunlight from pocket mirrors, their own kind of silent melody across the distance. The first flash came just after sunrise, 3 quick blinks from Wade's position. Movement in the trees. Below, Sullivan counted at least 6 riders, wearing war paint but sitting their horses like white men. Pike's mercenaries playing dress-up, trying to draw him into the open. Another flash from Wade, more urgent this time. 2 more groups were approaching from different directions, attempting to flank the homestead. The trap was being set, but not for the Hendersons. They were just the bait in Pike's elaborate performance. Sullivan allowed himself a grim smile. "Time to change the tune," he whispered, assembling the Sharps with practiced efficiency. Isha. Rifle was a precision instrument, as carefully maintained as his violin. He'd added a custom sight of his own design, calibrated for long-range work. The first shot caught the leader of the fake war party completely by surprise. One moment he was signaling to his men, the next he was toppling from his saddle. The range was impressive, over 400 yards. But Sullivan had learned long ago that music and marksmanship both required perfect pitch. Chaos erupted below as the mercenaries realized they were being hunted from above. They scattered for cover, their carefully planned attack dissolving into confusion. 2 more fell to Sullivan's rifle before they could reach the tree line. A flash from Wade's position warned of the second group trying to circle behind Sullivan's position. He'd expected this. Pike's men were nothing if not predictable in their tactics. Leaving the rifle, he drew his Remington and moved like a shadow through the rocks. The 4 men attempting to flank him were professionals, moving with military precision. But they were looking for a frontal confrontation, not understanding that Sullivan had been composing this deadly symphony since before they arrived. The first 2 never knew what hit them. Precise shots from behind, their bodies tumbling down the rocky slope. The third managed to turn and fire, but Sullivan had already moved, his footwork as graceful as a dancer's. The fourth threw down his weapon, realizing too late the difference between playing at war and facing a true artist of death. "Tell Pike," Sullivan said softly to the survivor, "that his orchestration needs work. Next time, hire real Sioux. They at least know how to move in these hills." By mid-morning it was over. 13 of Pike's men lay dead or captured, their elaborate plan turned against them. The Hendersons emerged from their home, shocked, to learn how close they'd come to being pawns in Pike's deadly game. "You saved our lives," Mrs. Henderson said, offering Sullivan coffee on their porch afterward. "How can we ever repay you?" Sullivan watched her children playing in the yard, innocent of the morning's violence. "Keep teaching them music," he said, noting the piano visible through their window. "The world needs more beauty in it, not less." But as he rode back toward Deadwood, Sullivan knew this was far from over. Pike would see this failure as just another rehearsal, learning from each attempt. The real performance was still to come, and it would take more than sharpshooting to survive. The final movement. Marcus Pike's private office in the Cheyenne Opera House rang with the sound of breaking glass as he hurled an empty whiskey bottle against the wall. The Carson brothers watched silently as their employer's cultured facade cracked, revealing the ruthless killer beneath the veneer of civilization. 13 men, Pike snarled, his refined accent slipping. 13 trained killers, dispatched like amateur street musicians. He grabbed his violin, playing a series of harsh, discordant notes that made everyone wince. "And now, he's made me look weak." Words spreading through every saloon from here to Deadwood about how the great Marcus Pike can't handle one Irish fiddler. Luke Carson stepped forward carefully. "Maybe it's time to consider a different approach. Sullivan's proven he can handle anything we throw at him from a distance. But the concert's in 3 days. He'll have to come closer eventually." Pike's eyes narrowed as he lowered his violin. "Go on. We've been trying to keep him away from Cheyenne, but what if we make it impossible for him to stay away?" Luke spread out architectural plans of the opera house on Pike's desk. "The governor will be here, along with every major business owner and lawman you've bought. Sullivan won't be able to resist the target. And when he comes," Frank added, catching his brother's thinking, "we'll be ready, not with hired guns or fake Indians, but with something he won't expect." Pike's rage transformed into cold calculation. "What did you have in mind?" Meanwhile, back in Deadwood, Sullivan sat at the Silver Dollars bar, cleaning his weapons, while Sarah Mackenzie talked about the latest news from Cheyenne. "Stagecoach brought the concert programs," she said, sliding one across to him. "Pike's planning quite a show. Half the territory's high society will be there." Sullivan examined the elaborate program, noting the list of prominent guests. "More than that," he said softly. "Look at the musical selection. Paganini's Devil's Trill Sonata. It's a piece that requires perfect timing between violin and piano." He looked up at Doc Wheeler. "You know it?" The old pianist nodded grimly. "Technically demanding, takes months of practice for 2 musicians to synchronize properly. Unless..." His eyes widened with sudden understanding. Unless they've performed it together before, Sullivan finished. Pike's not just announcing a concert. He's telling me he knows about Boston, about the conservatory, about her. Sarah looked between them, confused. Her? Sullivan's face had gone distant, lost in memories. Catherine, Pike's ward. We studied together before the war. She was special, a gifted pianist. His hand tightened on his gun. She disappeared the same night Pike's brother died in San Antonio. Everyone assumed she'd run away, but now... He's kept her all this time, Wade said from his position by the window, using her as bait. More than bait, Sullivan replied, opening his violin case. Inside, yellowed sheet music lay beside his guns. The same Devil's Trill Sonata. He's forcing her to perform with him. The timing, the precision required, it's a message. He's telling me exactly when and where the trap will be sprung. Emma, who had been practicing scales on Sullivan's violin, looked up. But if you know it's a trap, why go? Sullivan's smile held no humor. Because sometimes, little one, the only way to finish a song is to play it through to the end, no matter how dangerous the notes might be. He began to play, the haunting strains of Paganini's masterpiece filling the saloon. But there was something different in his performance now, an edge of controlled fury that made the devil's music sound truly demonic. In Cheyenne, Pike's preparations continued. Catherine sat at her piano, practicing under armed guard, her fingers moving mechanically across the keys. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't miss a note. She couldn't afford to, not if she wanted to survive the coming performance. The stage was being set for the final movement, and only time would tell which musician would play the last note. The day before the concert dawned cold and clear, with frost coating the Deadwood streets like crystallized music notes. Sullivan prepared for his journey to Cheyenne with the same methodical precision he brought to both his music and his gunfighting. Each weapon was cleaned, each bullet carefully selected, as if he were choosing notes for a final composition. "You don't have to do this alone," Sheriff Wade said, watching Sullivan pack his saddlebags. "I can gather some men, good men who'd ride with you." Sullivan shook his head, checking the action on his Remington one last time. "Pike's expecting that. He'll have the opera house surrounded, every approach watched. One man might slip through where many would fail." He paused, a ghost of pain crossing his features. "Besides, this is personal. Has been since Boston. Sarah." Mackenzie brought him a package of trail food, her face tight with worry. "Tell us about her, about Catherine. Might help to speak of it before you face what's coming." Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing the wooden curves of his violin case. "She was more than just talented," he finally said softly. "She had a way of making music speak directly to the soul. We were to perform together at our graduation concert, that same Devil's Trill Sonata Pike's chosen for tomorrow night. But then the war came, and you joined up," Doc Wheeler prompted gently. "Union Army." Sullivan nodded. "When I returned, everything had changed. Catherine had become Pike's ward after her parents died under mysterious circumstances. He was already building his empire, using culture to mask corruption. I tried to warn her, but she didn't believe you," Sarah guessed. "Worse, she believed me but felt trapped. Pike had evidence linking her brother to a series of murders, threatened to turn him in unless she played along with Pike's schemes." His voice hardened. "Found out later the murders were Pike's work, all along. By then, it was too late. The night I confronted his brother in San Antonio, she vanished." Emma, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Is that why you started hunting bad men? To find her?" Sullivan managed a small smile for the girl. "Partly, but also because I learned something during the war. Evil thrives when good people look away. Pike's brother taught me that some men can only hear one kind of music." His hand moved to his gun, the kind played with percussion. As he mounted up, the town gathered to see him off. Word had spread about the coming confrontation, and even the miners had come down from their claims to witness his departure. Sullivan sat straight in his saddle, the rising sun casting his shadow long across the street. "If I don't return," he told Wade, "Pike will send men to clean up loose ends here. The town will need protecting." Wade gripped his hand firmly. "We'll be ready. Sarah's ordered extra ammunition, and Doc Wheeler's been teaching some of the younger men about defensive positions." "Good." Sullivan's eyes swept the crowd, memorizing faces he might never see again. "One last thing. Emma's getting quite good with the violin. Make sure she keeps practicing. Music's too precious to let die." As he rode out, Emma began to play the Irish blessing he'd taught her. The sweet notes followed him down the street, a counterpoint to the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves. Other townspeople joined in, humming or whistling the tune, until it seemed the whole of Deadwood was offering its own musical prayer for his safety. Ahead lay Cheyenne and Pike and Catherine, and what promised to be the performance of a lifetime. Sullivan checked his guns one last time, then touched the violin case strapped to his saddle. 2 instruments, 2 arts, about to be joined in one final deadly concert. Behind him, Emma's violin notes faded into the morning mist, like the last peaceful melody before a storm of violence. Cheyenne's newly constructed opera house rose above the surrounding buildings like a conductor's platform, its elaborate architecture a statement of Pike's ambitions. As dusk approached, carriages began arriving, delivering the territory's elite to what promised to be the cultural event of the season. None of them noticed the lone rider watching from the shadows of a side street. Sullivan had arrived in town hours earlier, taking a circuitous route to avoid Pike's lookouts. He'd spent the afternoon studying the opera house from different angles, noting the positions of armed men disguised as doormen and ushers. The Carson brothers had been busy. Every approach was covered, every possible vantage point secured. "Quite a crowd gathering," a familiar voice said behind him. Sullivan didn't turn, having recognized the footsteps. "Didn't expect to see you here, Doc Wheeler," he said quietly. "Deadwood's a long ride for a piano player." The old musician moved his horse alongside Sullivan's. "Figured you might need someone who knows the Devil's Trill Sonata. Timing's everything, in music and in springing traps." Inside the opera house, Pike stood in Catherine's dressing room, watching her prepare for the performance. She sat at her mirror, her face a mask of controlled fear as she adjusted her elaborate gown. "He'll come for you, you know," Pike said, polishing his violin with practiced strokes. "Our mutual friend has always had a weakness for lost causes. And when he does," he smiled, letting the threat hang unfinished. "Michael's not a fool," Catherine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He'll know it's a trap." "Oh, I'm counting on it." Pike tested his violin strings, the notes sharp and discordant. "That's what makes it perfect. He'll know it's a trap. Know he's walking to his death and come anyway. Because of you." He leaned closer, his refined facade cracking slightly. "Just like he came for Thomas in San Antonio. But this time the performance will end differently." Outside, Sullivan and Wheeler had moved to the rear of the opera house, where deliverymen were still bringing in last-minute supplies for the evening's reception. "Loading docks watched," Wheeler observed. "But they're looking for a gunman, not musicians." Sullivan nodded, opening his violin case. Inside, nestled beside his guns, lay 2 sets of formal clothes. Pike's planned everything around the performance. The Devil's Trill Sonata takes exactly 12 minutes to play. That's when he'll make his move. "Unless we change the tempo," Wheeler smiled, patting his own instrument case. "Every conductor knows the power of unexpected timing." They changed quickly behind a wagon, transforming themselves into what appeared to be late-arriving performers. Sullivan's guns were concealed beneath his formal coat, but his hands felt naked without them as they approached the stage door. The guard there was one of Luke Carson's men, but his eyes slid past their musician's attire without recognition. "You're late," he growled. "Orchestra's already tuning up." Inside, they found controlled chaos as stagehands and performers rushed to prepare. Catherine was being escorted to the stage by armed men trying to look like gentlemen ushers. When she saw Sullivan, her eyes widened slightly, but she gave no other sign of recognition. Pike, standing in the wings with the Carson brothers, smiled coldly. "Right on time," he murmured. "Frank, make sure our friend Wheeler is given the appropriate piano. Luke, get the men in position. Remember, not until the final movement." Sullivan felt the weight of his hidden guns as he took his place among the orchestra members. Above them, the magnificent chandelier cast rainbow lights across the gathering crowd. Somewhere in the shadows, gunmen were moving into position, preparing for Pike's signal. The house lights began to dim. The overture was about to begin, but for once, Sullivan wasn't sure how this particular piece would end. The opera house lights dimmed to hushed anticipation as Pike took center stage, his violin gleaming under the spotlight. Catherine sat rigid at the grand piano, her face composed, but her eyes darting to where Sullivan stood among the orchestra members. The audience, Cheyenne's finest mixed with Pike's armed men, settled into expectant silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pike announced, his cultured voice carrying to every corner, "tonight we present Paganini's masterpiece, the Devil's Trill Sonata, a piece that demands perfect synchronization between violin and piano." His eyes found. Sullivan's in the shadows. One wrong note, one missed cue, can shatter the entire performance. Sullivan watched Pike's every movement, noting how the Carson brothers had positioned gunmen in the wings and upper balcony. Doc Wheeler, at his own piano in the orchestra pit, gave an almost imperceptible nod. He was ready to create a diversion when needed. The first movement began, Pike's violin singing with undeniable skill. Catherine's piano accompaniment was flawless but mechanical, like a prisoner performing under duress. Sullivan counted the armed men he could see, 14, with more certainly hidden among the crowd. As the music built toward its first crescendo, Luke Carson slipped through a side door, heading toward the backstage area. Sullivan knew he was setting up the second phase of their trap, but couldn't follow without drawing attention. Everything hinged on timing, on staying in character until the perfect moment. Pike began the second movement, his bow dancing across the strings with demonic precision. The Devil's Trill earned its name here, with runs so complex they seemed supernatural. Catherine's piano provided the foundation, her fingers flying across the keys. But Sullivan caught her subtle message. She was playing slightly faster than rehearsed, trying to throw off Pike's carefully planned timing. Frank Carson noticed too. He shifted uneasily in the wings, hand straying toward his hidden gun, but Pike adjusted smoothly, matching Catherine's tempo while shooting her a warning glare. The audience, oblivious to the deadly undercurrents, sat entranced. Sullivan used the movement's complexity to change position, sliding behind a curtain while pretending to adjust his music stand. He could now see the rope system controlling the massive chandelier, Luke Carson's target. They planned to drop it during the final movement, causing chaos while their gunmen opened fire. Doc Wheeler began his part, deliberately missing notes in the orchestra's accompaniment. The conductor turned in irritation, creating a distraction that let Sullivan slip further backstage. He found Luke Carson by the rope mechanism, already having cut partway through the crucial cable. "Should have stayed with the orchestra, Sullivan," Luke said without turning. "Now you'll miss the grand finale." "Always preferred chamber music myself," Sullivan replied softly. More intimate, Luke spun with remarkable speed, his gun appearing as if by magic. But Sullivan had already closed. The distance and the backstage area erupted in silent, deadly combat. They fought without noise, each knowing a single gunshot would trigger the trap too early. On stage, Pike reached the bridge between movements. Catherine's piano grew more insistent, her tempo increasing further. She was buying time, forcing Pike to concentrate on matching her pace rather than watching for his men's signals. Sullivan emerged from backstage just as the third movement began, straightening his tie. Luke Carson wouldn't be cutting any more ropes. But Frank, seeing his brother's failure, was already moving to implement their backup plan. The music built toward its climax, the devil's trill living up to its supernatural reputation. Pike played. With increasing fury, his bow movements becoming almost violent. Catherine's piano responded with equal intensity, the duet transforming into a duel of notes and rhythms. In the audience, hands moved toward hidden weapons. In the wings, gunmen tensed for action. Above, more of Pike's men crept into position along the catwalks. The final movement was approaching, and with it, the deadly crescendo that would transform this concert into a killing ground. Sullivan touched his hidden guns, waiting for the perfect moment. In music, as in gunfighting, timing was everything. The Devil's Trill Sonata reached its final movement, Pike's violin soaring over Catherine's piano with demonic intensity. The audience sat spellbound, unaware that every note brought them closer to an explosion of violence. In the wings, Frank. Carson gave the signal. Pike's men began moving into their final positions. Sullivan caught Doc Wheeler's eye. The old pianist nodded almost imperceptibly and began to modify the orchestra's accompaniment, subtly at first, then with growing complexity. The changes forced Catherine to adjust her tempo, which in turn made Pike struggle to maintain synchronization. Pike's face darkened as he recognized the manipulation. His bow movements became more aggressive, trying to force the performance back to his planned timing. But Catherine, understanding the game now, followed Wheeler's lead instead of Pike's, creating a musical chaos that disrupted the carefully orchestrated trap. "Now!" Frank Carson shouted, abandoning subtlety as the plan. Unraveled, gunmen rose throughout the theater, weapons appearing from under coats and behind curtains. But the distorted timing had thrown off their coordination. They were exposed too early, before the chandelier could fall to create their planned distraction. Sullivan moved like a conductor, directing a deadly symphony. His first shot took down the man assigned to drop the chandelier. His second found Frank Carson before he could complete his draw. The theater erupted into pandemonium as the audience finally realized the danger, their screams mixing with gunfire. Pike never stopped playing, his violin screeching out the devil's notes as his men died around him. Catherine dove from the piano, as bullets splintered its ornate wood, rolling behind its bulk for protection. Doc Wheeler's own hidden derringer barked twice from the orchestra pit, dropping 2 gunmen trying to flank Sullivan. "It was always going to end this way," Pike called, out, still drawing his bow across the strings. "Music and death, Sullivan. The perfect duet." "Wrong instrument, Pike," Sullivan replied, his guns speaking in rhythmic pairs. Each shot found its mark with the precision of a perfectly placed note, dropping Pike's remaining men one by one. "This is a solo performance." Pike finally cast aside his violin, drawing a hidden pistol from his coat. But Sullivan was already moving, his guns empty but his hands steady. They met at center stage, the spotlight casting their shadows huge against the backdrop. "She was supposed to be mine," Pike snarled, all pretense of refinement gone. "My protégé, my ticket into society. Then you filled her head with lies about justice and morality." "The only lie," Sullivan said softly, "was pretending music could hide the monster you are." Pike's gun came up just as Sullivan's fist connected. They struggled beneath the spotlight, their shadows dancing across the stage like figures in a grotesque ballet. Pike's pistol discharged harmlessly into the air before clattering across the boards. The final blow sent Pike stumbling backward into Catherine's abandoned piano. The impact drew forth a discordant crash of notes, a fitting epitaph for his life of violence, masked by cultural pretense. He slumped to the stage, defeated not by bullets, but by the very timing he'd tried to control. As the dust settled, Catherine emerged from behind the piano. She ran to Sullivan, who held her with one arm, while keeping his remaining gun trained on Pike. Doc Wheeler approached from the orchestra pit, covering the fallen crime lord with his derringer. "It's over," Sullivan said quietly. "The performance is finished." 2 days later, Sullivan rode out of Cheyenne, his violin case once again strapped to his saddle. Catherine travelled beside him, heading back to Deadwood, where Emma awaited her first proper piano teacher. Behind them, Pike faced a hangman's noose, his empire of violence crumbling as witnesses finally stepped forward. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked as they rode. "Still hunting bad men?" Sullivan smiled, touching his violin case where both instrument and guns rested together. "There's always another song to play," he said softly, "but maybe now we can make some better music together." As they rode toward the horizon, the morning sun caught Sullivan's violin case, making it glow like a promise of brighter tunes to come. The legend of Sweet Note Sullivan would live on in the territories, but now it carried a different melody, one of justice served and harmony restored.